Have you ever stumbled upon a name in the Bible that made you stop and think, wait, who is that? A name that doesn't quite fit, doesn't explain itself, and yet holds enormous spiritual weight. If you've ever read the story of Abraham and come across the name Melchizedek, chances are you paused, scratched your head, and maybe even Googled, who is Melchizedek in the Bible? That's probably what brought you here, and trust me, you're not alone. What if I told you that buried within just a few verses in Genesis is a character so mysterious, so out of place, and yet so central to God's greater plan, that some believe he may not have been human at all? Some call him a priest. Others say he was a king. But there are those who believe he was something more, something divine. Today, we are going to unlock one of the Bible's greatest unsolved mysteries, and by the end of this video, you're going to know the truth that has baffled scholars, rabbis, and theologians for centuries. The kind of truth that changes how you read the Bible forever. Now, let's be real. If you're here, you're the kind of person who doesn't settle for surface answers. You're not just casually scrolling. You want to understand things at a deeper level. You're curious. You question what you read. And most importantly, you feel like there's something beneath the surface of Scripture that's been waiting for you to discover. That's why this story isn't just a dry historical breakdown. This is a spiritual deep dive, crafted just for you. Because Melchizedek isn't just a side character. He might just be the missing link in your understanding of Jesus, salvation, eternity, and even your own personal calling. So stay with me, because we're not only going to explore who Melchizedek was, we're going to examine why he matters right now in your life, in your walk, and in the confusing times we're living in. There's something powerful waiting to be revealed, and I promise, if you stay till the end, the answer you came for is going to hit harder than you expect. Picture this. Abraham, fresh from battle, dusty, blood-stained, leading a rescue mission to recover his kidnapped nephew Lot. After the dust settles, out of nowhere, this mysterious figure named Melchizedek appears. He's not from Abraham's camp. He's not listed among the kings involved in the battle. There's no genealogy, no backstory, no introduction. Just this. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. That's it. That's how we meet him. No origin, no end. And somehow, this is the person Abraham gives a tenth of everything to. Abraham, the father of nations, tithes to Melchizedek.
Pause and let that sink in.
In the entire Old Testament, no one gets that honor from Abraham. Not even angels. But this guy does.
Why?
See, here's where it gets fascinating. The Bible says Melchizedek was both a king and a priest, something that was absolutely forbidden later in Israel's history. Kings were kings. Priests were priests. The two roles were separated under the law of Moses. But this man, long before Moses was even born, held both titles. King of Salem, which means King of Peace. Priest of God Most High, a priesthood that predates the Levites. And when we fast forward thousands of years into the book of Hebrews, the writer doesn't just mention Melchizedek once. He devotes an entire chapter to him. Hebrews 7 says Melchizedek was without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life. That sounds less like a man and more like something eternal, something otherworldly, something divine. Now I know what you're thinking. Could Melchizedek have been Jesus? Could he be the Holy Spirit? An angel? A pre-incarnate appearance of Christ? That's what we're going to get into, step by step. But before we dive too deep, I want you to really consider this. Why would the Bible, which is so meticulous about lineage and backstory, especially in Genesis, introduce someone so important without giving us any background at all? That's not by accident. That's intentional. This mystery was planted like a seed. It was meant to be revisited, reflected on, and eventually revealed. The more we understand about Melchizedek, the more we begin to understand the eternal nature of Christ's priesthood and why Jesus didn't come as a Levite, why he wasn't just a prophet or teacher, why he came in the order of Melchizedek. That's the key. And if you miss this, you miss one of the most crucial connections between the Old and New Testaments. Let's go back to something deeper. Have you ever felt like your faith journey has missing pieces? Like you know the Bible is true, but there are verses and stories that don't quite click? That's not your fault. The Bible is layered. It's like a puzzle. Some pieces are big and obvious, but others are small and strange and seem like they don't belong until they do. And Melchizedek is one of those strange pieces. But once you find where he fits, the whole picture starts to make sense. It's like turning on the light in a room you thought you already explored. Suddenly, you see details that were always there, just waiting to be noticed. That's what this video is about. We're not just doing a character study. We're pulling back the veil on something spiritual, something that touches prophecy, priesthood, salvation, and the very identity of who Jesus is and why he came. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We have to walk through this story together, slowly, piece by piece. We're going to look at the context, the symbolism, the ancient history, and the New Testament connections. You're going to hear theories, some that sound logical, others that sound wild. And you're going to decide for yourself. Was Melchizedek a man? A supernatural being? Was he Jesus himself before Bethlehem? Or was he something we still don't fully understand, because God chose to keep him wrapped in mystery until the right time? The answer is in the Bible, but it's hidden in plain sight. And by the end of this video, I'm going to show you where it is. No fluff. No clickbait. You're here because you want the truth. And that's exactly what you're going to get. But here's the master move. You have to watch the whole story unfold. Because if you skip ahead or leave early, you'll miss the very pieces that make it all come together. Think of this like a spiritual detective case. I've gathered the clues. I've got the scrolls, the references, the ancient traditions, and the historical context. But I need you to stay with me, to track the trail, to think critically and spiritually at the same time. This isn't just about watching a YouTube video. This is about encountering a mystery of God that's been hiding in plain sight for thousands of years, and it's finally time for you to understand it. If you're someone who's hungry for spiritual truth, who's tired of surface-level teaching, and who wants to go deeper into the mysteries of the Bible, you're in the right place. We're going to meet Melchizedek in 3 dimensions: historically, theologically, and spiritually. We're going to explore his impact on Abraham, his connection to Jesus, and the stunning way he disrupts everything we think we know about biblical authority and divine purpose. You're going to learn how his brief appearance in Genesis sets the stage for a revelation that stretches all the way to the cross. You'll see why the bread and wine he offers Abraham is no coincidence, and how it foreshadows a greater covenant. You'll learn why Jesus wasn't just any kind of priest, but one whose authority goes beyond time, law, and
Bloodline.
And you'll realize that this mysterious figure isn't just part of the past. He's tied to your present walk with God. But here's the twist, the one detail most people miss. There's a prophecy, a single verse in the Psalms, almost hidden, that connects Melchizedek directly to the Messiah. Psalm 110 verse 4 says, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, in the order of Melchizedek."
Think about that.
Not in the order of Aaron, not in the line of Levi, but Melchizedek. That one line unlocks a whole new understanding of who Jesus is and how salvation works. And when we return in the next part of the story, we're going to break down that verse and see how it connects prophecy to priesthood, ancient Jerusalem to heavenly authority, and one man's mystery to all of humanity's hope. Because what if Melchizedek wasn't just someone Abraham met? What if he was someone you were meant to meet too? To understand who Melchizedek truly is, we have to rewind and start unpacking the background that's often overlooked. You see, this isn't just a pop-up moment in Genesis, where a king blesses a patriarch and disappears. No, something deeper is happening here, something cosmic, something divine, and something that may have been orchestrated long before Abraham even set out from Ur. At this point in Abraham's life, everything is shifting. He's no longer just a man following a promise. He's becoming the father of a nation. He's just led a daring military raid, outmaneuvered 4 powerful kings, and rescued his nephew Lot from enemy hands. But right after this victorious moment, at the peak of his earthly success, he encounters a man with no army, no agenda, no allegiance to the known kingdoms, and yet Abraham instantly recognizes his spiritual superiority.
Think about that.
Abraham, who just outsmarted a league of kings, bows before this mysterious priest-king and gives him a tenth of everything. This wasn't just an offering. It was an acknowledgement. Abraham saw something holy. And that's where the mystery thickens. Who exactly was Melchizedek aligned with? He wasn't part of any known tribe. The city he ruled, Salem, is believed to be the ancient foundation of Jerusalem, but at the time, there was no Israel, no covenant, no temple. Yet here he is, already serving as priest of God Most High. That title, El Elyon, is not a casual one. It's one of the highest names for God in the Old Testament, used to indicate absolute supremacy. So, how did Melchizedek come to know the Most High God before Abraham's covenant, before Moses' law, before the Ten Commandments were ever written? That's what scholars can't answer. And that's why theories abound. Some claim he was a remnant of a forgotten line of faithful priests tracing back to Adam. Others believe he was a prophet in his own right, one chosen by God to keep the flame of righteousness burning in a dark world. But here's where things get strange. There are legends, even outside the Bible, that suggest Melchizedek was more than a man. Some Jewish mystics believed he was Shem, Noah's son, still alive due to his long lifespan. Others speculated he was an angel in human form. And then there are those who go even further, who claim Melchizedek was a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ himself. But let's take a breath before we jump to conclusions. Let's talk relationships, influence, and timing. Abraham had just defeated the armies of Kedorlaomer and the Eastern kings. No small feat, these weren't small tribal skirmishes. These were international military alliances. Abraham and his 318 trained men launched a nighttime ambush and took them down. So this moment should have been a celebration, a military parade, a public display of victory. Instead, Abraham is quiet, humble, and almost unsettled. It's like he knows the battle was bigger than him. That's when Melchizedek shows up, not to congratulate him on the win, but to bless him spiritually. He brings bread and wine, not food for celebration, but symbols. Ancient, sacred symbols. The same elements Jesus would later use at the Last Supper. That's not a coincidence. That's a divine thread pulling through time, connecting priesthoods, connecting covenants, connecting destinies. And let's not forget who else was there. The king of Sodom. A man known for corruption, compromise, and greed. He tries to reward Abraham with riches, offering the spoils of war, but Abraham refuses. He says, "I will accept nothing from you, so you cannot say, 'I made Abram rich.'" That rejection speaks volumes. Abraham is clearly being tested, not just in war, but in loyalty. He chooses spiritual blessing from Melchizedek over worldly reward from Sodom. That moment right there marks a fork in the road, one that sets Abraham on a path toward divine destiny and sets Melchizedek apart as someone worthy of reverence. But here's the twist. What if Melchizedek wasn't just there to bless Abraham, but to test him? What if this mysterious figure shows up precisely at moments when human pride is ripe, when temptation lingers, when decisions determine destinies? And here's where the red herrings start to creep in. Some say Melchizedek was a Canaanite king who happened to worship the same God as Abraham. But that theory doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The Canaanites were deeply entrenched in idol worship, and nowhere else do we see any hint of monotheism among their rulers, except here. That's the problem. It doesn't fit. And if he was just a righteous king, where did he learn about El Elyon? There's no record of divine communication, no prophetic call, no heavenly encounter. He just appears, fully equipped, already a priest, already a king, already representing the Most High God. Now others believe Melchizedek was actually a Christophany, a theological term for a pre-Bethlehem appearance of Jesus. That would explain the eternal language in Hebrews. Without father or mother, without beginning of days or end of life, a priest forever. But if that's the case, why does the Bible still treat him as a separate figure? Why doesn't Genesis spell it out? Why didn't Abraham bow and worship, as others did when encountering divine beings? Or maybe, just maybe, Melchizedek was intentionally cloaked in mystery to protect a sacred truth, a truth too powerful to be understood at the time, a truth that would only make sense after Jesus came in the flesh. Because, let's not forget, God often hides his deepest revelations in plain sight. The mysteries aren't there to confuse us. They're there to invite us into a deeper pursuit. And just when you think you're getting closer to an answer, another possibility throws you off balance. What if Melchizedek was part of an ancient priesthood that God had established long before the Levites? What if he belonged to a divine order that operated outside of the law, outside of the temple, outside of time itself? That would explain his sudden appearance, his supernatural authority, and his eternal relevance. But it would also open up a whole new world of spiritual dynamics that most believers have never even considered. Because if there was a priesthood before Levi, then Jesus stepping into that role isn't a break from tradition. It's a return to a higher, older, holier way. That means the cross wasn't just an act of redemption. It was the reactivation of an ancient covenant, one that started with Melchizedek and culminated with Christ. So, where does that leave us? In a maze of possibilities, each one more intriguing than the last. Was Melchizedek an ancient king with secret knowledge? A divine figure in disguise? A spiritual placeholder until the Messiah would come? Or was he something else entirely, something we still haven't fully grasped? Every clue we follow opens another door. Every verse we read raises another question. But that's exactly how mysteries work. They don't give you the full picture all at once. They pull you in, make you question what you thought you knew, and dare you to look deeper. And just when we think we're close to unraveling the truth, we find out the most shocking detail has been hiding in plain sight all along. But you'll see it soon.
Just don't look away now.
The deeper we go, the closer we get to the revelation that changes everything. Just when it seemed like Abraham had encountered a divine turning point, something began to shift, quietly, subtly, like a shadow creeping in at the edges of a sacred moment. The air around Melchizedek's blessing still lingered, heavy with mystery, but questions began to rise in Abraham's mind long after the encounter ended. Why had this man come and gone without a trace? No mention of where he lived.
No tribe.
No ancestry. No successors. No legacy left behind in the land. It was like he stepped into the story from another dimension, left his mark, and disappeared into the ether. But the silence after his departure wasn't peace. It was a vacuum. And nature, especially spiritual nature, hates a vacuum. The more Abraham tried to remember the details, the more certain memories blurred. Conversations became fragmented. Melchizedek's words sounded different in hindsight, and some of the blessings seemed to carry layered meanings he hadn't caught before. That's when something even stranger happened. Abraham asked his trusted servant Eliezer, who had accompanied him into battle, to recount the exact moment Melchizedek arrived. Eliezer paused, confused. "My lord," he said, "we never saw him approach. One moment we were counting the spoils. The next he stood there." Abraham pressed further, asking for a description, but Eliezer's answers were vague, almost like he couldn't recall the man's face. That wasn't normal. This wasn't just forgetfulness, it was as if something or someone was interfering. Abraham returned to the place where they had met, the Valley of Shave, hoping to find some remnant, some sign. But the stones had been overturned, the earth disturbed, and the chalice Melchizedek had used for the wine was gone. Abraham had placed it there, hidden it under a mound of rock as a memorial, but now there was no trace it had ever existed. Then came the warning. A shepherd boy, no older than 12, wandered into Abraham's camp late at night, pale and shivering. He claimed to have overheard a conversation between foreign traders passing through the hill country. One of them, cloaked and quiet, had warned another, "If the Hebrew keeps digging, the ancient veil will tear. He must stop. The priest is not to be found." When Abraham asked the boy for more details, the child seemed to hesitate, like he was afraid to speak. Then he ran, vanished into the darkness, never to be seen again. No one in the camp could find him the next morning. It was like he'd been sent, just like Melchizedek, to deliver a message and disappear. But if that wasn't enough to rattle Abraham, The betrayal that followed nearly shattered his trust. One of his own kinsmen, Lot's elder servant, was discovered sneaking off in the dead of night, carrying scrolls and carved tablets that Abraham had carefully documented his divine encounters on. When caught, the man claimed he was delivering them to the scribes in Salem, but under pressure, he admitted something darker. They said the knowledge was too dangerous, he confessed. They promised protection if I help hide it. Who they were, he wouldn't say. But this act of treachery cracked something in Abraham's resolve. He realized there were others, perhaps even entire groups, who didn't want the truth about Melchizedek to surface. Not because they didn't believe it, but because they did. And that truth threatened everything they stood for. As Abraham wrestled with this, he began to piece together fragments from the past, visions he had once dismissed as dreams, voices that had whispered to him in the quiet moments after prayer. One night, long before the battle with the kings, he had seen a figure robed in white standing over an altar made of fire and smoke. The figure had spoken a single phrase: "The order exists, but it is not yet revealed." At the time, Abraham thought it was just symbolic. But now it felt like a warning, or maybe a prophecy. There was also a name, one that had been scratched into a stone Abraham had found along the ancient trade route between Damascus and Hebron. The name was worn, almost erased, but faintly visible: Adonizedek. At first glance, it looked like a royal title, Lord of Righteousness. But as Abraham asked around, he discovered that Adonizedek had once ruled Salem generations earlier, and some believed he was connected to Melchizedek, or even his predecessor. The stories didn't match. Some claimed he was a tyrant, others a prophet. But none could agree on when he lived, or if he even existed at all. It was like history had swallowed him whole and left behind only whispers. And that's when Abraham received a message, written in a language older than Hebrew, sealed in wax and tied with gold thread. It came from a mysterious figure who claimed to be a guardian of the priesthood. The letter was clear: "You seek answers not meant to be found. If you continue, you will awaken what was bound. Let the priest rest." No name, no return path, just a final warning: stop searching. But Abraham couldn't stop. The pieces didn't fit. The silence was too loud, the mystery too deep, and the truth, whatever it was, seemed just one revelation away. But as he prepared to dig even deeper into the past, he didn't realize someone had already been watching, and that someone knew exactly who Melchizedek was, and more terrifyingly, what he would become. While Abraham wrestled with the eerie letter and the shadows tightening around his discovery, something was quietly unraveling in a place far from his camp. Sarah, his wife, often left out of these divine conversations, was experiencing strange dreams of her own. She hadn't told Abraham at first, not wanting to disturb him during such a tense and spiritually heavy time, but the visions became too vivid, too real to ignore. Night after night, she saw a man standing on a mountain with eyes like fire and garments shining like morning light. In one dream, he reached out his hand toward her and said, "He searches for what he cannot yet hold." She would wake drenched in sweat, gasping for breath, only to find that her tent was strangely colder than the rest of the camp, as if something or someone had passed through just moments before. When she finally told Abraham, his face went pale. That same mountain, that same figure, had visited his dreams as well, but Abraham had never mentioned it aloud. How could two people, separated by tents and responsibilities, be seeing the same being, delivering the same cryptic message? Before they could even begin to make sense of it, another layer was pulled back, this time through Isaac's wet nurse, an older woman who had lived quietly among their household for years. She approached Sarah one evening with trembling hands and revealed something she had kept secret for decades, that long before she joined Abraham's family, she had served a priesthood in the Northern Highlands, one dedicated to the righteous one of Salem. The name struck Sarah like lightning. She asked, "Melchizedek." The woman nodded, then pulled from her robes a small amulet, a copper disc etched with unfamiliar symbols and the words Tzaddik Cohen, meaning righteous priest. The nurse claimed that in her youth, she had witnessed a ceremony where a priest, taller than any man she'd ever seen, walked across burning coals without harm and spoke words that made the wind stop mid-breath. He never aged, she whispered. Every few years, we would see him again. Always the same. Never older. We called him the Silent Flame. Sarah immediately brought the amulet to Abraham, but as soon as he touched it, a searing heat shot through his palm. Not hot enough to burn flesh, but sharp enough to sting the soul. It was as if the object had recognized him, or rejected him. That very night, the winds across the plain changed direction. Tents groaned under their pull. Fires flickered out without warning. And a strange marking, like an ancient glyph, appeared on the side of one of the caravan wagons, though no one had drawn it. As the servants debated its meaning, Abraham felt an unsettling truth burrowing into his thoughts. Someone, or something, was watching every move they made, and this journey into Melchizedek's mystery wasn't just revealing history, it was stirring a force long buried. As if fate had orchestrated it, news arrived the following morning from a caravan traveling up from Egypt. One of the merchants carried with him a stone tablet unearthed in the ruins of a collapsed temple near Zoan. It bore the likeness of a man seated on a throne, holding a staff crowned with a sun and a crescent moon. The inscription read, "To the high priest king of Salem, who walks between the worlds." The moment Abraham laid eyes on the image, his breath caught. It wasn't just the title, it was the face. The same expressionless gaze, the same regal posture, the same aura of authority he remembered from Melchizedek. But the tablet predated Abraham's encounter by centuries.
How could that be?
Things only grew more tangled when Lot, Abraham's nephew, returned to the camp after weeks of silence. He looked thinner, restless, his eyes constantly darting toward the hills. When pressed, he finally revealed he'd been approached by a mysterious traveler during his time near the Valley of Siddim, a man cloaked in dark linen who spoke of ancient powers and offered Lot knowledge of an eternal order in exchange for loyalty. Lot had refused, unsettled by the man's intensity, but not before the traveler warned him that Abraham was too close to the hidden scroll, and that if he persisted, the curse of knowledge would fall upon his line. Lot hadn't understood what that meant until days later, when the food in his caravan spoiled overnight, his camels refused to move, and his servants began falling ill with a strange fever. He had returned not out of loyalty, but out of fear. This revelation shook Abraham more than he admitted. He knew that stepping closer to the truth meant danger, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. The warnings weren't idle threats. They were lines drawn in spiritual sand. Every new clue, every old symbol, every whisper from the past pointed to a reality far bigger than one man or one priest king. This was about legacy, about heaven's secrets kept hidden for generations, about a battle between light and darkness playing out behind human events. And then, just as the pieces began to form a rough outline, something even more shocking came to light. Hidden beneath the folds of the copper amulet was a parchment, thin, aged, and nearly unreadable. It had been sewn into the cloth backing like someone had tried to protect it. Under lamplight, Abraham and Sarah could just barely make out the writing, a passage describing the priest who will return before the throne is built, whose blood is not of man, whose word silences storms. And beneath that, a final line that made the fire in Abraham's soul flare with holy terror. He was not the first. He will not be the last. Whatever Melchizedek was, he was part of something much bigger. But they weren't the only ones reading those words. Outside the camp, just beyond the torchlight, someone stood motionless, eyes fixed on the parchment, waiting for the final seal to be broken. The air had grown heavier in Abraham's camp, like something unseen was pressing down from above. Every night felt colder, even when the desert winds were still. Fires burned lower. Animals grew restless. And the people, once confident and settled, now spoke in whispers, casting glances over their shoulders as though they expected shadows to move on their own. It wasn't just superstition. Something was changing. Something dark. Abraham, for all his strength and faith, began to feel it deep within his bones. He had been a man of conviction, a man called out by the voice of God, but now that voice had gone quiet, replaced by silence, so profound it screamed. He couldn't pray the same way anymore. He couldn't sleep without hearing faint sounds, footsteps that never left prints, voices that vanished the moment he turned to listen. It all reached a terrifying climax one night when Sarah vanished. She had gone to fetch a water jar from the other side of the camp, a simple act, a few minutes at most. But when the moon had climbed higher and she still hadn't returned, Abraham knew something was wrong. He ran to the spot himself, calling her name, but there was no answer. What he did find was worse than silence, a faint trail of sand disturbed, as though someone had been dragged. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no discarded fabric, just an unnatural path leading toward the rocky outcrops beyond the tents. Abraham followed it with his heart pounding like a war drum, his hands trembling in a way they never had during battle. He expected to find her injured or taken by raiders. What he found instead was her water jar, upright, unbroken, and chillingly full, as though she had simply vanished mid-step. He called for his men. They searched through the night and into dawn, but Sarah was gone, without a trace. It was as if the earth had swallowed her. That morning, Abraham stood in the middle of the camp, surrounded by his tribe, unable to find the words. His closest companion, Eliezer, stepped forward with a hollow look in his eyes and handed Abraham something wrapped in cloth. It was Sarah's shawl, folded neatly, placed on Abraham's cot while everyone was out searching. No one had seen who left it there. No one could explain how it appeared. Then came the final blow. Etched into the wood post beside his bed was a message. No ink, no paint, just scorched letters burned into the grain like lightning had written it by hand. It read, "She walks among the veiled ones now. Return, or you will join her." The words were unmistakably clear. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't fate. It was a threat, deliberate, personal, and terrifying. From that moment, something inside Abraham changed. He had faced armies. He had endured famines. He had even argued with God himself. But this was different. This was a darkness that didn't play by earthly rules. And it was closing in. He began to suspect everyone. Even Eliezer, who had been by his side since Damascus, now seemed distant, as though guarding secrets of his own. He remembered the betrayal from Lot's servant, the stories from Sarah's nurse, the vanishing child messenger, and the faceless traveler who had spoken to Lot. Were these scattered incidents, or pieces of something more sinister, a network of forces determined to bury Melchizedek's truth forever? Abraham's paranoia deepened. He started seeing patterns in the flames of his campfires, hearing Sarah's voice in the howling wind. He would wake from dreams with her name on his lips, only to feel the emptiness beside him like a fresh wound. The people in his tribe noticed his change. Some whispered that he had gone too far in chasing forbidden knowledge. Others feared they had become cursed by his obsession. But no one dared confront him. Not after the animals began dying without cause. Not after 2 of the younger servants fell ill, their eyes clouding with white like they had seen something no man should. Still, Abraham refused to retreat. If anything, the danger only solidified his need to uncover the truth. He returned to the place where Melchizedek had first appeared, this time alone, hoping for answers, or perhaps for confrontation. But the valley was colder now, lifeless. The grass had browned. The birds that once filled the air were silent. And in the center of that place, someone had carved a circle of symbols into the earth, symbols that matched the ones on the copper amulet. They pulsed faintly in the moonlight, as though alive. Abraham stood there, breath visible in the night air, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down on him. Every warning, every vision, every lost clue echoed in his mind. Melchizedek wasn't just a priest. He wasn't just a king. He was part of something older than time, something that still watched, still whispered, still chose when to reveal and when to erase. Abraham had thought he was uncovering history. But now, with Sarah missing, The veiled threat burned into his tent, and an invisible force growing stronger around him. He realized the terrifying truth. He wasn't just discovering Melchizedek's story. He was becoming part of it. And whatever that meant, it was far from over. Abraham had returned to the burned circle in the earth again and again, desperate for meaning, for answers, or at least a sign that he wasn't losing his grip on reality. But the deeper he dug, into the ground, into memory, into the silence, the more elusive the truth became. It wasn't just Sarah's disappearance that haunted him now. It was the eerie realization that time itself felt distorted around him. Days stretched oddly long, nights rushed by with unnatural speed, and people in the camp began forgetting things, basic names, tasks, even entire conversations. The fear was no longer just spiritual, it had become mental, psychological, as if something unseen was toying with their perception. And then, everything shifted with one quiet knock on the back post of Abraham's tent. It was Eliezer. But he wasn't alone. With him stood a young woman none of them had ever seen before, her robes unfamiliar, her eyes intense and unwavering. She spoke with a calm voice, but what she said shattered everything Abraham thought he understood. She claimed her name was Keturah, and that she was Sarah's sister. Abraham was stunned. Sarah had never mentioned a sister, living or lost. The woman explained that she had been taken from their household as a child, hidden away by a group called the Watchers of Salem, a secret order tasked with guarding the truth of Melchizedek's origin. Her story unraveled like a scroll of buried secrets. She spoke of rituals hidden deep in the caves beneath Mount Gerizim, of elders who could manipulate memory and reality, and of one forbidden truth they had sworn to protect for generations. Melchizedek was not of this world. It wasn't metaphor. It wasn't symbolism. Keturah described in chilling detail how Melchizedek had appeared at different points in history, not reincarnated, not descended, but the same, unchanged, timeless being. Her order had kept records, stone carvings and ancient writings passed down long before Abraham's time, depicting Melchizedek walking among Sumerians, standing at the gates of Jericho, even appearing in Egyptian temples as a man of no father, no mother. The line Abraham had read in the hidden parchment, "He was not the first. He will not be the last," wasn't about succession. It was about iteration. Melchizedek had emerged at every critical junction in human civilization, not as a guide, but as a catalyst. Sometimes blessing, sometimes judging, always observing. The twist carved into Abraham's mind like a chisel on stone. He had spent so long trying to decode Melchizedek's identity. Was he man, angel, prophet, but never considered the most terrifying possibility. What if Melchizedek wasn't here to be understood? What if his role wasn't divine appointment, but divine surveillance? The hidden order believed Melchizedek came when humanity reached a spiritual threshold, moments when history could tip toward collapse or redemption. His appearance wasn't a gift. It was a test. And Abraham had passed through it unknowingly. But the revelations didn't stop there. Eliezer, the one man Abraham had trusted like a son, stepped forward with eyes full of sorrow and handed Abraham something he'd hidden for years, a second letter, written in the same peculiar hand as the first message that warned Abraham not to pursue Melchizedek. This letter, however, was dated years before Abraham ever met Melchizedek. And worse, it was addressed to Eliezer, not Abraham. In it, Melchizedek spoke directly to Eliezer, calling him by a name Abraham had never heard before, Elisarel, and instructing him to keep Abraham's faith strong, to guide him gently and, if necessary, to deceive him to ensure he remained on the path. Abraham's heart sank. His most loyal companion had been planted in his life by Melchizedek himself. Every encouragement, every warning, every step forward Abraham had taken toward this mystery had been orchestrated. And then came the final turn. Keturah revealed the greatest secret of all. Sarah wasn't missing. She had been taken by the Watchers for protection because she had begun to remember. Not just her dreams, but past lives. According to Keturah, Sarah had seen Melchizedek before. Not in dreams, but in memory. She had once served in the Temple of Salem under his watch, not as a priestess, but as a recorder. a witness to truths no mortal should carry. That was why she had been chosen as Abraham's partner. That was why Melchizedek had blessed her womb despite her age. She wasn't just a wife. She was a vessel of memory, sleeping until the right moment. Now that moment had come, and with it, the unraveling of every assumption Abraham had made. Melchizedek wasn't just a mysterious figure. He was the orchestrator. Eliezer wasn't just a servant. He was the handler. Sarah wasn't just a victim. She was a key. And Abraham? He wasn't the seeker of truth. He was the experiment. And the trial had only just begun. Abraham sat by the dying fire, the smoke curling into the cold night like whispers from another world. Everything he thought he knew, about Sarah, about Eliezer, about his own divine calling, was now tangled in a knot of betrayal, secrecy, and ancient forces beyond comprehension. The weight of revelation pressed down on him with a suffocating intensity, but the pressure hadn't yet peaked. That came when Keturah placed a small, sealed scroll into his hand. It was brittle, old, bound with a cord of red sinew that smelled faintly of frankincense and blood. "You're not supposed to read it," she said. "Not yet. But you need to decide if you're ready to live with the truth or die without it." That's when the ultimatum came. Keturah revealed that the Watchers had given Abraham a narrow window, 3 days, to abandon his pursuit of Melchizedek and return to his camp, where Sarah would be returned unharmed and his people left in peace. But if he refused, if he insisted on unraveling the mystery, then the Watchers would unleash a consequence not even Abraham could fathom. "This isn't about you anymore," Keturah warned, her eyes flickering with something between fear and reverence. "The deeper you go, the more you risk everything, your tribe, your bloodline, even your covenant." It wasn't a threat. It was a reckoning. And in that moment, Abraham wasn't just staring at a decision. He was staring at the edge of destiny. Torn, Abraham retreated into solitude, trying to make sense of it all. Could he really turn his back on the truth now that it was so close? Could he trust Keturah's word, or was she yet another figure sent to manipulate him, to lure him into a trap under the guise of salvation? Eliezer found him at dawn, silent and still, and for the first time in years, Abraham couldn't look him in the eye. The man who had served him, prayed with him, fought beside him, had also deceived him at the behest of something or someone divine. And yet, when Abraham finally spoke, it wasn't with anger. It was with grief. "How long have you known?" he asked, voice ragged. Eliezer hesitated, then answered with the weight of a man who had carried a secret for far too long. "Since the wells of Uar. Since before you knew the name Melchizedek." The admission hit Abraham harder than any blade. His entire journey, from the call to leave his father's house, to the victories over kings, to the covenant made under the stars, had been guided, nudged, choreographed. He had believed himself chosen, but now wondered if he had ever truly chosen anything at all. The emotional blow of betrayal was devastating, but it was the next confession that nearly broke him. Eliezer admitted he had once been part of the Watchers. He had left their circle when he grew disillusioned with their methods, believing Abraham might be the one to resist their influence. But as time passed and Melchizedek reappeared, Eliezer realized the plan had never truly changed. It had only been postponed. Faced with this unbearable reality, Abraham was left with a choice that felt impossible. He could take the scroll to the stone altar in the hills and burn it by sunset, signaling his surrender to the Watchers and reclaiming the life he had lost. Or he could break the seal, read the forbidden words, and open the door to a truth that might cost him everything. It wasn't just a matter of curiosity. It was about Sarah, about trust, about whether he could live with knowing he had walked away from the one person who had truly believed in him, the one person who had disappeared into the darkness because of his pursuit. As he held the scroll in trembling hands, the sounds of his camp shifted in the background. Children's laughter faded. Footsteps grew distant. It felt as if time itself were pausing, waiting for him to decide. He looked at Eliezer, whose eyes were red-rimmed and swollen with remorse. Abraham wanted to hate him, but he couldn't. He had loved him too long. And that's what made this choice so excruciating. Every path led to loss. Every decision cut something from his soul. But before Abraham could make his choice, a distant horn echoed from the edge of the valley. Riders. Dust kicked up in the horizon. It was not the Watchers. It was not the tribesmen. It was a caravan bearing the banner of Salem, Melchizedek's seal, unbroken and gleaming in the sunlight. The man at its front wore a hood, face hidden, hands covered, and behind him rode someone draped in a white veil. Abraham's heart slammed against his ribs. It looked like Sarah. But was it truly her? Or another deception? Another piece in a cosmic game that had no rules? And just like that, the question of the scroll vanished beneath a newer, deeper uncertainty. The time to decide had arrived, but the moment for truth was slipping through his fingers. The hooves of the horses hit the earth like war drums, kicking up a rising wall of dust as the caravan approached. Abraham stood frozen at the mouth of his tent, scroll still clutched tightly in his hand, breath caught somewhere between hope and dread. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to rally his people, but something deeper, something ancient and unshakable, told him this moment had been fated. The figure beneath the white veil dismounted slowly, gracefully, but with a weight in their posture that made Abraham's chest tighten. He took a cautious step forward, heart pounding so loud it drowned out the wind. He wanted to call her name, but before he could, the figure reached up and peeled back the veil, not to reveal Sarah, but someone else entirely. Keturah. And she was no longer the soft-spoken guide of the Watchers. Her face was painted in the ceremonial ash of the Salem priesthood, her eyes no longer gentle but sharp, calculating. Behind her, the hooded man removed his covering, revealing not a stranger, but one of Abraham's own chiefs, Barak, the man who had overseen the livestock, the one who always sat just outside the circle during council meetings, who rarely spoke but always listened. Abraham's knees nearly buckled. Barak? A spy? Since when?
Why?
The answers came too fast, too brutal. Keturah spoke with authority now, her voice commanding the same gravity Melchizedek's once had. She revealed what had been hidden beneath every sign, every vision, every manipulation. This wasn't about Abraham alone. It was never about just him and Sarah and the promise. This was a test, a generational one. Abraham was only the latest in a line of candidates. Every few generations, the Watchers would select a man whose lineage, character, and spiritual openness marked him as a possible bridge, someone who could withstand the full revelation of the truth and survive it. But none had succeeded. They either gave in to power, to fear, or worse, they exposed the truth to the world before it was ready. Abraham had simply been the next subject in a long, brutal series of spiritual experiments. But what tore through him wasn't the size of the conspiracy, it was the betrayal from within. Barak had been with him since the journey from Haran. He had helped bury Abraham's father. He had held Sarah's hand when she thought her womb would never open. Now he stood at Keturah's side like a loyal hound. When Abraham asked him why, the answer cracked through the tension like a whip. Because you were never meant to win, Barak said. Only to choose. And you've already failed. Eliezer stepped forward, rage in his face, sword half drawn. He hasn't failed. He's still standing. But Keturah shook her head, calm and chilling. It doesn't matter now. The scroll was never a choice. It was a marker. The moment you touched it, the ritual began. The fire you saw, the dreams Sarah had, the disappearances, all symptoms. The veil between worlds is already thinning. Salem is rising again, not as a city, but as a state of being. And those unprepared will not survive it. Abraham's blood turned cold. The dreams, the altered time, the way people forgot things. Salem wasn't just an ancient city. It was a threshold, a spiritual plane that intersected with the physical, and Melchizedek had been its sentinel. But now someone or something was trying to rip that door wide open. Not through faith, not through covenant, but by force. And he was the unwitting key. The betrayal sank deeper. Keturah admitted that Sarah had indeed been taken, but not for her safety. She had been used to open the veil. Her memories were not accidents. They were planted. Triggers. She had been exposed to the relics of Salem as a child, through dreams guided by the Watchers, and now she was the epicenter of the coming shift. Abraham's heart cracked. Everything had been manipulated, his love, his loyalty, even his desperation to find her. Not out of cruelty, but to activate him, to push him toward the edge of the spiritual map, so he'd open the door they couldn't. And it had worked. All around him, the signs began to escalate. The sun grew dim without a cloud. The birds that once circled above vanished. A strange, pulsing sound began vibrating through the earth, as if the land itself were chanting something in a language no one remembered. The people in the camp emerged, drawn like moths to the gathering. And above them, the seal of Salem hovered, not physical, but real in their minds, their hearts, an ancient symbol burned into their collective soul. Abraham had no more time for grief, for confusion, for denial. The scroll he held was vibrating now, humming with the same pulse that shivered in the ground. He looked at Keturah, at Barak, at Eliezer. Each face now carried a different truth, one of faith, one of betrayal, one of purpose. He could no longer tell who was enemy or ally. The conspiracy was larger than kingdoms, older than any covenant, and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The veil was tearing, the world as he knew it was about to change. And he was standing at the center of it, the chosen, the deceived, the bridge. And just as the pulse reached its peak, just as his vision began to fade into blinding white, the scroll in his hand unraveled by itself, and what was written inside would challenge the very definition of creation. The wind roared across the valley like an angry tide, thick with dust and the scent of scorched earth. Abraham stood at the center of the storm, the unsealed scroll now floating inches above his palms, pulsing with light that was neither fire nor sun. Around him, the world buckled. Trees bent toward him, shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the very sky cracked in jagged streaks of violet as if the heavens themselves were breaking apart. Keturah circled him slowly, chanting in a tongue lost to every tribe and tongue, her voice low and deep, filled with the weight of forgotten ages. On the cliffs above, the remaining elders and watchers formed a perfect ring, faces painted with ash, silent but wide-eyed with reverence and fear. The ritual had begun. The threshold to Salem, to a realm beyond time and flesh, was opening, and Abraham was at its heart, not as a king, not even as a prophet, but as a conduit for a truth that had waited since the dawn of human memory. But he wasn't alone anymore. Sarah had emerged from the veil, not broken, not controlled, but awakened. Her voice cut through the chaos, clear and unwavering. Abraham, don't listen to her. She needs your faith, not your soul. The moment their eyes locked, something ancient snapped inside him. Not fear, not rage, but clarity. For too long, he had wandered blindly through signs and symbols, trusting whispers and visions. Now he saw it. Keturah wasn't channeling the Watchers. She was their vessel. She wasn't just a guide. She was the gatekeeper, and worse, she had been born from Salem's very essence. She wasn't human. Not fully. And everything he had done, from leaving Uar to offering Isaac, had led him here not by destiny, but by design. The scroll flared once more, and a shape formed in its light, a man's figure, robed in seamless linen, eyes blazing with light. Melchizedek. He stepped forth from the projection, not merely as a vision, but as presence incarnate. Yet his face was torn in grief. Abraham, she's lied to you, he said, his voice thunderous yet deeply mournful. I never returned. What you've seen were fragments, echoes. She took my name. She took my place. But Salem is not hers to command. It is balance. Harmony. What she wants is domination. If the veil fully breaks now, humanity will not ascend, it will fracture. Keturah's voice shifted, darker, more guttural. He speaks of balance because he fears power. He never understood what the bridge could do. But you Abraham, you have already broken the first seal. Finish the rite. Open the path, and I will give you everything. Your son's future, your nation's glory, even Sarah's eternal life. The sky cracked again, and a ring of fire circled the mountaintop. The ground beneath Abraham's feet began to split. The decision had to be made, and fast. One voice offered love, the other legacy. But only one could be trusted. Then the final piece clicked into place. It was not the scroll. It was not the Watchers. It was the staff Melchizedek had carried in every vision, the staff Keturah now gripped like a serpent coiled in gold. It bore the etching of an ancient tree, not the tree of life, but the tree of knowledge. It wasn't a holy relic. It was the original key used by the first Watchers to twist the boundary between the divine and the human. That was why the scroll glowed near it. That was why Abraham had been chosen. Not because of righteousness, but because he had the lineage that could awaken its final form. Abraham looked at Sarah, who now stepped forward, placing her hand over his heart. You know what you have to do.
He did.
And it terrified him. He turned to Keturah, scroll glowing, the words now searing into his skin. You deceived me with truth twisted just enough to taste like hope, he said, lifting the scroll higher. But I see you now. Not as a priestess. Not as a guide. But as the final Watcher. The one who fell and survived, using memory as a weapon. Keturah hissed, the illusion breaking for a heartbeat. Her form flickered, revealing wings of scorched bone, eyes too black to reflect light. She screamed and lunged for the scroll. But Abraham, in one last act of defiance, raised it above his head and tore it in half. The sky exploded in silence. Time stopped. The flames vanished. The Watchers crumbled like dust in the wind. Keturah's body dissolved, shrieking, twisting back into vapor, her last words caught in a vortex of unmade light. Melchizedek faded with her, giving Abraham a final nod, not of approval, but of peace. The gate to Salem closed, and the veil, once ripped open, now resealed, not by force, but by the will of a man who chose truth over power. Abraham collapsed to his knees, the mountain eerily quiet, the people below dazed but alive. Sarah ran to him, wrapped him in her arms, and whispered, You brought us back. But just when it felt over, when peace returned and the world resumed its rhythm, Eliezer appeared beside them. His face was calm, his eyes unreadable, and in his hand he held a second scroll. I never gave you the original, he said softly. What you destroyed was only the mirror. And the story, it seemed, was only just beginning. The wind had settled now. The valley that once echoed with divine thunder and spectral light was quiet, almost too quiet, as though nature itself held its breath, unsure whether to return to its usual rhythm or wait for something else to stir. Abraham sat beneath the tall fig tree at the edge of the mountain ridge, his robes torn, his beard streaked with dust and ash, but his eyes, those once filled with fire and fury, were now heavy with a deep, unshakable calm. The kind of calm that comes only after everything you thought was true has been unraveled and rebuilt from pieces you never knew existed. Around him, life slowly resumed. The tents of his people were being reassembled, the flocks released from their holding pens, the children chasing each other through the sparse grass. There was laughter again, soft and cautious at first, but growing like a spring after long drought. Yet beneath all that renewal, there remained an awareness that what had occurred on that mountain would never be spoken of plainly. Not because of fear, but reverence. Some truths were too large for words, too ancient to be explained. And maybe Abraham thought that was how it was meant to be. Sarah stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, the way she used to when he returned from journeys that had gone longer than expected. She no longer questioned what he had seen or what it had cost him. She had her own visions now, her own memories of what it felt like to be inside the veil, untethered from time, exposed to a presence that made her feel both microscopic and infinite. She didn't need explanations. She knew something greater than both of them had touched their lives, and they had survived it. But they weren't the same. The promise they had built their lives around, the lineage, the legacy, the divine nation, no longer felt like a reward. It felt like a responsibility, one too fragile to wield with pride. From now on, every step would be watched. Every decision would echo through generations. And that was the heaviest weight of all. Eliezer, who had vanished shortly after revealing the second scroll, returned days later under the cover of darkness. His face was marked with something deeper than regret. It was knowledge. He handed Abraham the real scroll, not glowing, not vibrating, just old parchment sealed with wax and string, weathered by time and dust. "It doesn't sing anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Whatever power it had, it's dormant. Or waiting. Abraham stared at it but didn't touch it. Not yet. He understood now that answers had a cost, and not every mystery needed solving in this lifetime. Sometimes just knowing the question was enough. Eliezer knelt and asked forgiveness, not just for his deception, but for his loyalty to something that had twisted faith into control. Abraham placed his hand on the man's head and offered no words, only silence. Not every betrayal deserved a speech. Some only needed time and distance to find redemption. Words spread slowly through the outer settlements. Whispers of a prophet who faced a divine test, of a woman who walked between worlds and returned untouched, of a city once lost now glimpsed in the sky like a ghost. Pilgrims began arriving, bringing gifts, seeking wisdom, hoping to stand on the mountain where the veil had thinned. Abraham welcomed none of them. He stayed among his people, tending the fields, repairing stone walls, walking with Isaac at dawn, teaching the young men how to listen for meaning in silence. He gave no sermons, built no monuments. His life became simple again, but it held a gravity that pulled others toward him without needing to speak a word. He was no longer chasing the covenant. He had become part of it. But Salem was not gone. Some nights, when the air grew still and the stars aligned just right, a strange hum returned beneath the soil, and the fires from the north flickered in patterns too perfect to be random. Sometimes Abraham would wake before dawn and see Sarah standing at the edge of the encampment, looking out into the mist, her eyes reflecting a light that hadn't come from the sun. And in those moments, he knew the story wasn't over. The door hadn't closed completely. It had simply shifted, waiting for the next hand to find its key, the next seeker to rise, the next soul strong enough to hold the truth without breaking. Years passed. The people flourished. Isaac grew into a man. The line of Abraham expanded across the land like vines reaching toward prophecy. But no one ever found the scroll again. It disappeared one day, not stolen, not hidden, just gone. As if it had returned to wherever it first came from. And no one dared to search for it. They all felt it, that chasing what should remain sealed only invites the veil to thin again. And not every soul survives what lies behind it. In the end, Abraham didn't die in battle, or fade with divine thunder. He passed quietly, in his sleep, holding Sarah's hand. And as they laid him in the cave beneath the sacred tree, the wind whispered through the branches in a voice none of them recognized but all of them felt. It said nothing, and yet, in its silence, it spoke volumes. And so the question remained, not just who Melchizedek was, or what Salem truly held, but whether humanity would ever be ready to face a truth too vast to contain in a single life. That question echoed across generations, across scriptures, across stories passed in whispers around fires and dinner tables. And somewhere, beyond what the eye could see, the veil pulsed once again, patient, watching, waiting. Because some mysteries are never solved. They're lived. And if you've made it this far, maybe, just maybe, you were meant to be part of that mystery too.